Hi, I'm Jack Howell. I have an audio clip on my phone of a live radio broadcast of a clarinetist playing Weber's First Concerto with an orchestra. I don't want to embarrass anybody, and I don't actually know who the clarinetist is, so I won't play the clip, but I'll try to recreate it. Any doubt what happened? The soloist stopped the air, breathed, regripped the embouchure, and bit that E flat like a piranha. We've all been there. This video is not a blanket condemnation of embouchure pressure. There are plenty of great players with very active embouchures, and regulating pressure on the reed to some degree is an important part of clarinet playing system. It becomes a problem when we use jaw muscles instead of the muscles around the mouth to control the reed. Id est when we have a poor embouchure and use the chewing muscles instead. Our lips are extremely sensitive and subtle and occupy a large percentage of our brains. When I was in college, there was a figure called the cortical homunculus that was supposed to represent the amount of cerebral cortex devoted to the various body parts. And here I'm putting it up. As you can see, hands, big. Lips, tongue, big. Jaw, not so much. The jaw has evolved to munch, not to exert precise control or to show subtle expressions. But whatever muscles we use, it's a problem when we develop an imbalance between pressure on the reed and airstream energy. I'm not sure how much time I should devote to talking about the clarinet playing system at this point. I've kind of started on it, but I have to make this video in particular because I spend a lot of my time as a teacher trying to get students to stop or at least reduce biting and thus squeaking. And I want this as a video reference for them. So I'm going to challenge everybody, not just my students, to hang in there for 30 seconds while I talk about negative and positive feedback loops. When it's hot, our body temperature rises, so our sweat glands produce sweat, which cools us by evaporation. This is a negative feedback loop. The hotter we get, the more we sweat. If the opposite happened, and rising body temperature triggered a fever, that would be a positive feedback loop and we would die. A nuclear explosion is one example of a runaway positive feedback loop. In fact, the only real use constructively for a positive feedback loop is to create an explosion of some sort, like labor and delivery, which is what my med student daughter said when I asked for an example of a normally non-fatal biological positive feedback loop. So for this discussion, we will consider a clarinet squeak to be an explosion of some sort. Squeaks happen for various reasons. We can fail to cover a tone hole completely and create an unintentional register key. The reed can warp or get old and stop vibrating. A mouthpiece can wear out and it can leak around the rails at the pivot point. The most common reason, though, is biting. Almost all of us start playing the clarinet by biting. Our first instructor can go blue in the face talking about embouchure and air support, but in the beginning we simply cover the lower teeth with the lower lip and we blow like we're blowing up a balloon and eventually we get a sound. Not a very pleasant sound generally, but it's a start. We discover as we play, if we put a little pressure on the reed, which bends the reed a little closer to the mouthpiece, the sound starts more easily. And unless we have good instruction, we start chewing the reed every time we want to start the sound, or change notes, or stop a note, or play a difficult interval, or anything. And we squeak a lot. And instead of encouraging beginning clarinetists to use lots of air and make a full sound, band directors often, not clarinetists, often try to get beginners to make a prettier sound by playing softer. The beginners blow less hard, which means they must bite more to start the sound. And then when they try to blow harder while they're biting, they squeak. The developing clarinetist thus learns to associate squeaking with blowing, not with biting, and therefore uses less air, which requires more embouchure pressure to restrict the reed enough for the insufficient air to make a sound. At this point, the air is serving the embouchure, and it should be the other way around. So when the student tries to use more air and play louder, the restricted reed tends to squeak even more, which the player tries to stop by biting. This is a positive feedback loop, trying to stop a squeak by doing what causes a squeak. Professionals generally do the opposite. When they feel a squeak coming on, they soften the embouchure and soak up the squeak. But if we're a beginner, if we have a positive feedback loop and we want to play louder or stop squeaking, we need to introduce some negative feedback. The easiest thing to change is the equipment. So unless, again, we have good instruction, we play a harder reed, a more open mouthpiece, or both. This may do the trick, but then again it may not. A harder reed is harder to chew, so it's harder to make it squeak. But it's also harder to articulate and harder to play softly. So we may wind up biting more, perhaps until we start squeaking again, at which point we play a still harder reed and or an even more open mouthpiece. Where this arms race winds up, who knows? Some very famous players play very heavy setups. I played a very heavy setup myself for a time. Most of us reach a limit of what our lower lip will take. And I know how y'all love stories, so I'm going to tell you how I wound up with a positive feedback loop that almost ended my career. In the mid-90s, when I was principal in New Mexico, making my own reeds, I took an audition, I think in Cincinnati. Going through my reeds in the hotel room the night before, I was playing Midsummer Night's Dream Scherzo on my best reed. Very clear, great response, an excellent audition reed. And then, you know those D minor arpeggios beginning on low A? One of the A's chirped. I tried it again, and it chirped again. Damn it, I thought that was my best reed. So I got through the audition on another reed, but the fear of chirping was planted, and I started testing all of my reeds, specifically to make sure they wouldn't chirp in the low register. You know what happened? I got really good at making reeds chirp. I got so good that I could make any reed chirp on any mouthpiece. And as I played mouthpieces with ever thicker rails and used ever heavier reeds, the chirping only got worse. A colleague could play my setup and be unable to make it chirp if they could play it at all. I could play their setup on which they never chirped, and I would chirp like a damn canary. Anytime I had to play a sharp low register attack, the fear of chirping would summon my frankly astounding ability to chirp, and the more important the concert, the more immediate and powerful the positive feedback loop became. It was almost, and maybe it actually was, a kind of focal dystonia, and for a time I seriously actually considered quitting. And I'm sorry to say it took me a while to figure out what was going on. I didn't feel like I was doing anything to cause the chirps. I felt like it was just coming from the setup. I thought maybe the cut of my reeds, maybe it was the quality of the cane, maybe there's a problem with the mouthpiece. And I needed something special. So I went back and forth with mouthpiece makers, trying to find a mouthpiece that wouldn't chirp. And it didn't exist. When I finally realized that I was the problem and that I couldn't feel what I was doing because that's how habits work, I set about curing myself. I practiced on the thinnest railed, chirpiest mouthpiece I had, and I played my chirpiest reeds. If a reed chirped once, I wrote C on it and I practiced on it. And I wailed on it. I would absolutely slug low register attacks, and if they chirped, I'd slug them harder. And I performed on equipment that gave me a margin for error, a margin for safety, but concerts were scary, and it wasn't a quick fix. I won my one-year job in Pittsburgh in 1996 on a very open, thick-railed mouthpiece. It took me years to get rid of that chirp, and I remain alert for signs of a relapse. I'm still haunted by the memory of a studio recording session. It was like maybe 1998. And the part consisted mainly of low register attacks, and the chirp fairy showed up. I think I only really fixed it when I started playing with Mike Rusnick in 2000, and he gave me an old proofer mouthpiece that had his facing on it. It's a fairly long, very close facing, which is what I still play. I still consider myself to be in recovery, because if you think a chirp on soprano is unemployable, try it on bass. Now realize, at this point, I was making a living as a professional clarinetist at the time that biting became a problem for me. Before that, biting had worked just fine. I played Van Doren 5.5 reeds in high school and won solo competitions. When I switched to Mitchell Lurie 5.5s when I started studying with Bill Jackson. And when he started making his own reeds around 1984, I started making my own reeds too. And they were probably even heavier. So I was doing all right. I was playing principal in New Mexico, playing the Santa Fe Opera and the Chamber Music Festival in the summers. But I had to be biting. When other players would try my setup and not be able to get a sound out of it, I was kind of proud. But then it went completely sideways. So the question is not whether biting is good or bad. It is what to do if it becomes a problem. For the soloist who inadvertently made a party tape performing Weber First Concerto on live radio, it was a problem. If your articulations are quacky, it's a problem. If you can't play softly without going sharp or fuzzing out, it's a problem. If you can't make soft attacks, or if you squeak. I was going to say if you squeak once in an etude, but really, if you squeak in concert more than once every 3 to 5 years, it's a problem. So if biting is a problem and you want to stop, here's what I suggest. First, stop using bite-enabling equipment. Daniel Bernard was anti-biting. He taught a stable jaw. When he had a student who was biting, he would simply make them play on extremely soft reeds. I think that's kind of my first line of defense too. But for the biting student, I also usually replace the M30, which they normally are playing, with an M15 or D'Addario XO. I mostly cured my own biting with reeds, but a long, close-facing mouthpiece, I think, is what finally polished it off. Choosing equipment that compensates for flaws seems like it only makes sense. But that's also the first step of a positive feedback loop. If you are a serious biter and you switch to a D'Addario XO with a 3.5 reed, you'll probably be miserable. You may sound terrible. Temporarily. If you have a good ear, the clarinet playing system will compensate. You'll learn to stabilize your jaw pressure and let the reed vibrate. You will feel the difference your oral cavity makes once you cannot bite the reed without slamming it shut. And if you force yourself on this setup to play loudly, you will make the sound good with airstream focus. It takes discipline to play equipment that exposes your flaws instead of concealing them, but it's effective. Now for some, that's all it takes. And, if there are great players who play heavy setups, there are equally great players who play light setups. So it's not a prerequisite. Harold Wright did not play on hard reeds. Dan McElway told me that when Wright died, Wright's wife gave him, Dan, some of his reeds, and they were very soft. Robert Marcellus did not play on hard reeds, particularly. According to Ted Owen, Marcellus said that his best reeds started out being a little too soft. Now, I'm not saying that you should go out right now and perform on reeds that are too soft and sound terrible, but if you practice on gear that lets you bite, you will keep biting. Changing equipment works, but some players just can't. They just can't stand it. It's much more difficult to stop biting while playing equipment that is optimized for biting, but nothing is impossible. So let's look at some anti-biting drills, and they can be supplements to changing to soft reeds also. The first drill that I commend to your attention is the Thompson airstream drill. I made a video with Tommy about it. I'll link it in the description, where you take the reed off and use the airstream focus with the back of your tongue to make a sound. This drill stops you from biting by removing the reed. No reed, nothing to bite. It also focuses and increases the air. Primarily, we bite because there's not enough air or enough airstream focus. Biting bends the reed close enough to the mouthpiece so that whatever air we do have makes a sound. By requiring the airstream to make a sound with no reed, we reverse that. We oversupply air from the diaphragm like water from a reservoir. We control it with the back of the tongue like a faucet, and we use only as much embouchure pressure as we need, holding a stable jaw. And with no reed there, that's zero embouchure pressure. So here's the thing to know with this drill. Biting and airstream focus are like Harry Potter and Voldemort. While both survive, neither may live. If you focus the air and bite, you will squeak. Most students who bite, and they do the airstream drill, they'll put the reed back on, they'll squeak, and they'll stop focusing. Because the habit, the positive feedback loop, is subconscious. It takes a serious act of will to maintain the airstream focus and the energy until the jaw learns to stay the hell out of it. The second drill is my double tongue drill. There's, again, a link in the description. Because a lot of biting usually comes from articulation, from chewing the reed instead of using the tongue, when you introduce a foreign articulation mechanism, one of two things. Either you will not bite on the K, and then when you bite on the T, you'll feel it, or because the K is an automatically focused airstream, if you bite, you will squeak. And the only way to not squeak is to not bite, because if you don't focus the airstream, you won't make the K. Another drill that I often use for anti-biting is the center of the stake drill, which I describe in other videos, beginning with the wisdom of Trevor Wye. By feeling the center of the tone, withdrawing the air, and then replacing the air without changing anything else, the player is encouraged to use airstream energy rather than embouchure pressure to start the tone. And the quality of the tone itself is diagnostic for the air pressure, air energy embouchure pressure imbalance. The only problem is that it depends heavily on player awareness and honesty to detect biting. Because if the player doesn't want to stop biting, they'll just learn to bite the attacks better, and they'll fake an airstream attack more convincingly. Other articulation drills like the contact drill and ghost tone drill can help detect and quiet biting by isolating the tongue contact, but again, it depends on the student being aware, honest, and wanting to change. You know, in trying to stop squeaking by stopping biting, I've tried everything. I've had students play double lip. I've had them turn around and put the reed on top. This is just a feedback mechanism because the upper lip is not toughened to biting and it generally objects to it. When we bite, we can feel it as pain. One final piece of advice. Anytime you're playing anything, pay close attention to the last note of each phrase. If the last note is thin or fuzzy or sharp, you're biting the reed. And it's a little somewhat natural. You're at the end of a phrase, you're running out of air, and the easiest thing to make the air last is to bite. And it's also the worst thing you can do. If you're biting at the end of a phrase, you're almost certainly biting at the beginning. Go get 'em.